I woke up at 6 in the morning to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside my bedroom window, and by the time I stumbled onto my back deck with my coffee still brewing, my brand new guest house was already a pile of splintered wood and crushed dreams. My name is Connor Walsh, and I had spent the last 8 months planning, permitting, and building that guest house on my property in Riverside, California. 8 months of meetings with architects, contractors, city planners, and yes, even the Homeowners Association. 8 months of dotting every single I and crossing every single T to make sure everything was done by the book. And now, as I stood there in my pajama pants and old college t-shirt, watching a demolition crew tear through what used to be a beautiful 800-square-foot structure, I felt like I might actually lose my mind. "Hey!" I shouted, running down the deck stairs and across my lawn. "What the hell are you doing? Stop! Stop right now!" A burly guy in a hard hat turned to look at me, his expression somewhere between annoyed and indifferent. "HOA ordered the demolition, buddy. Structure's illegal. You got a problem. Take it up with them." "Illegal? That's impossible. I have all my permits. The city approved everything." He shrugged and went back to directing his crew. "Not what we were told. We got our work order from the Riverside Meadows HOA board, signed by the president herself. Says right here, this structure violates multiple covenants and was built without proper approval." I felt my face getting hot despite the cool morning air. "I don't care what it says. You need to stop right now. This is my property, and you're destroying my building without my permission. We got permission from the HOA. That's all we need." He waved to another worker. "Keep going. Guys, let's get this wrapped up before noon." I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. If they wouldn't listen to me, maybe they'd listen to the police. The operator answered, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained that there was a demolition crew actively destroying my property without my consent. "Sir, do you own the property?" the operator asked. "Yes, I own it. It's my house, my land, my guest house they're tearing down." "And did you receive any notice about this demolition?" I paused. Had I received notice? I thought back through the last few weeks. There had been the usual HOA newsletter, some junk mail, bills, but nothing about a demolition. "No, I didn't receive anything." "Officers are on their way, sir. Please stay calm and don't interfere with the workers." I watched helplessly as another wall came down. The guest house had been beautiful. Clean lines, modern fixtures, a full bathroom and kitchenette. I'd planned for my parents to stay there when they visited from Oregon. My dad had cancer, and the treatments were rough. Having a private space where they could rest without feeling like they were imposing had seemed like the perfect solution. Now it was rubble. 2 patrol cars pulled up within 10 minutes. Officers Martinez and Chen introduced themselves and asked me to explain the situation. I walked them through everything while the demolition continued in the background, each crash making me wince. "Do you have documentation showing you own the property and that this structure was permitted?" Officer Martinez asked. "Yes, absolutely. Everything's in my home office. Let me get it." I ran inside, my heart pounding. My office was organized, thank God. I'd kept everything in clearly labeled folders because the permitting process had been so extensive. I grabbed the folder marked Guest House Construction and rushed back outside. The officers reviewed the documents while I stood there, watching another chunk of my investment crumble. I had the original building permit from the city of Riverside, stamped and approved. I had the architectural plans that had been submitted and accepted. I had the contractor's license and insurance information. I had inspection reports showing the electrical, plumbing, and structural work had all passed city codes. Everything was there, neat and official. "This all looks legitimate," Officer Chen said, glancing at her partner. "Sir, do you mind if I call the city planning office to verify these permits?" "Please do. I'm telling you, everything was approved. I wouldn't have spent $60,000 building something illegal." While Officer Chen made her call, Officer Martinez approached the demolition crew. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the noise of the machinery, but I saw the crew boss pull out paperwork of his own. The two of them examined it together, and then Martinez came back to me. "They have a work order from your HOA signed by a Patricia Brennan. The order states that the structure was built in violation of HOA covenants and without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee." "That's garbage," I said, feeling my frustration boil over. "I submitted my plans to the HOA 9 months ago. I went to 3 different meetings. Patricia Brennan herself told me at the last meeting that everything looked fine as long as I got city approval, which I did." Officer Chen finished her call and walked over. "The city planning office confirms that all permits for this guest house are valid and up to date. The structure passed all required inspections. According to the city, this is a completely legal building." Thank God. Finally, someone was listening to reason. Martinez turned back to the crew boss. "You need to stop work immediately. The property owner has valid city permits, and there's a dispute about the HOA's authority here." The crew boss looked annoyed. "We already knocked down most of it. Someone's got to pay for this work." "Take that up with whoever hired you," Martinez said firmly. "But you're done here. Pack it up." The crew grumbled, but started loading their equipment back onto their trucks. I stood there looking at the destruction, my stomach churning. 3 walls were completely gone. The roof had partially collapsed. The bathroom fixtures were exposed and broken. The kitchenette I'd spent hours picking out was smashed beyond recognition. Even if I could prove I was right, the damage was catastrophic. "Mr. Walsh, I'd recommend you contact a lawyer," Officer Chen said quietly. "This is going to be a civil matter between you and your HOA, but you may have grounds for a lawsuit given that you had proper permits." "Do you know Patricia Brennan?" I asked. "The HOA president?" "I've dealt with her before," Martinez said, his expression carefully neutral in that way cops have when they're trying not to express an opinion. "She takes HOA rules very seriously." That was putting it mildly. Patricia Brennan was a nightmare. She was the stereotypical HOA president, a woman in her mid-50s with too much time on her hands and an obsessive need to control everything in the neighborhood. In the 2 years since I'd moved into Riverside Meadows, I'd watched her fine people for having their trash cans visible from the street, measure the exact height of everyone's grass, and send violation notices if your car was parked in your own driveway for more than 48 hours. She patrolled the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV like she was on some kind of mission from God to enforce suburban conformity. I'd tried to stay off her radar. I kept my lawn perfect, my house painted in approved colors, my garbage cans hidden in the side yard. But when I'd started planning the guest house, I knew I'd have to deal with her directly. The HOA covenants required approval from the Architectural Review Committee for any exterior modifications, and Patricia chaired that committee personally. The meetings had been exhausting. The first one, Patricia had peppered me with questions about every single aspect of the design. How tall would it be? What materials would match the main house? Where exactly would it sit on the lot? Would it be visible from the street? I'd answered everything, showed her the architectural drawings, explained that it would be tucked in the back corner of my lot, barely visible to anyone. She'd frowned and said she needed to review the covenants more carefully before giving approval. Meeting 2, a month later, had been more of the same. She'd brought up obscure rules about setbacks and lot coverage, questioned whether a guest house counted as a secondary structure under the covenants, and suggested I might need a variance. I'd done my research by then and pushed back. The covenants allowed accessory structures up to 1,000 square feet, as long as they maintained the architectural character of the neighborhood and didn't exceed height limits. My guest house was 800 square feet, matched my main house's craftsman style perfectly, and was only 12 feet tall at its peak. I met every requirement. Patricia hadn't liked being contradicted, but she couldn't point to any actual violation. The third meeting, she'd finally said, "Fine. If the city approves your permits, the committee won't stand in your way. But make sure you follow every single rule, Connor. We have standards in this neighborhood." And I had followed every single rule. I'd gotten the city permits, hired licensed contractors, scheduled every required inspection, and built exactly what I'd shown in the architectural drawings. The guest house had been finished for 2 weeks, and I'd been so proud of it. My parents were supposed to visit next month. My dad's treatment schedule had an opening, and they were going to stay for 3 weeks. Now they'd have nowhere to stay except my couch. After the police left and the demolition crew packed up, I stood in my backyard staring at the wreckage. Pieces of drywall littered the grass, broken glass from the windows caught the morning sun. The foundation was still intact, at least a concrete slab with exposed pipes sticking up where the bathroom had been. It looked like a bomb had gone off. I called my contractor, Miguel Santos, and explained what happened. He was silent for a long moment. "Connor, man, I'm so sorry. That's insane. We did everything right on that build." "I know. Can you come take a look? I need to understand how much damage we're talking about and whether it can be salvaged." "I'll be there in an hour." Next, I called my real estate lawyer, Dennis Park. Dennis had helped me with the purchase of the house 2 years ago, and he'd given me advice during the permitting process. When I told him about the demolition, he swore loudly. They can't just tear down a permitted structure, Connor. That's destruction of property. Do you have documentation of everything?" "Yes, all of it. The cops confirmed my permits are valid." "Good. Don't touch anything at the site. Take photos of everything. I'm going to draft a letter to the HOA demanding they cover all damages and cease any further action against your property. We'll probably need to file a lawsuit, but let's start with the demand letter. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" "Yeah, I'll be there." I spent the next 2 hours documenting everything. Photos from every angle, close-ups of the broken fixtures, wide shots showing the extent of the destruction. I found pieces of the work order the demolition crew had left behind and photographed those too. Then I went through all my files and made copies of everything related to the guest house, every email exchange with the HOA, every permit document, every inspection report, every receipt. If we were going to war with Patricia Brennan and the Riverside Meadows HOA, I wanted ammunition. Miguel arrived and walked through the debris, shaking his head. "This is bad, Connor, really bad. The structure itself is compromised. Even though the foundation is okay, all the framing is damaged. The roof is gone, the walls are down, and everything inside is destroyed. We'd basically have to rebuild from scratch." "How much are we talking?" "To rebuild? Probably the same as the original, maybe 60 to 70,000 depending on what we can salvage. But honestly, there's not much to salvage here. They were thorough." I felt sick. $70,000. I didn't have that kind of cash lying around. The first build had stretched my budget as it was. I'd saved for 2 years to afford it. "What about insurance?" Miguel asked. "I'll call them, but I don't know if they'll cover intentional demolition by a third party. This wasn't a storm or an accident." "Yeah, that's tricky, but you should definitely try. And make sure you get estimates for the rebuild. You'll need that for your lawsuit." After Miguel left, I called my homeowner's insurance company. I spent 45 minutes on hold before finally reaching an adjuster who listened to my story with what sounded like genuine disbelief. "So the HOA hired a company to demolish your structure, even though you had valid city permits?" "That's correct." "And you didn't authorize this demolition?" "Obviously not." "Okay, I need to talk to my supervisor. This is unusual. We'll send an adjuster out to assess the damage, but I'm not sure if this falls under your policy. Intentional acts by third parties might be excluded. You might need to pursue the HOA directly for damages." Great. So I was probably on my own financially. That afternoon, I drove to Dennis Park's office in downtown Riverside. Dennis was a sharp guy in his early 40s, Korean-American, with a reputation for being tough but fair. His office was in a nice building near the courthouse, and his assistant brought me coffee while I waited. When Dennis called me in, he already had documents spread across his desk. I pulled the Riverside Meadows HOA covenants and the California Civil Code sections on HOAs. Tell me everything from the beginning. I walked him through the whole timeline, planning the guest house, the meetings with Patricia and the Architectural Review Committee, getting city permits, the construction process, the inspections, and finally, this morning's demolition. Dennis took notes, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification. "Did you ever receive written approval from the HOA?" he asked. I paused. "No, actually. Patricia said in the third meeting that they wouldn't stand in my way if I got city approval, but I don't think she put that in writing. She just said it verbally." "That's a problem. Do you have any witnesses to that conversation?" "There were 2 other committee members there. Brad something and Linda Morse, I think." "We'll need their statements. What about the city permits? When did you get those?" "The city approved my initial application in February. I got the actual permits in March and started construction in April. The final inspection passed 3 weeks ago." Dennis nodded, writing. "And the HOA never sent you any violation notices or warnings before today?" "Nothing. If they had a problem, they never told me." "That's actually good for us. California law requires HOAs to follow specific procedures before taking enforcement action. They have to send a written notice describing the violation, give the homeowner a chance to correct it or request a hearing, and exhaust administrative remedies before pursuing more aggressive action. Demolishing your structure without any notice or due process is a serious violation of your rights. So what do we do? First, I'm sending them a demand letter today. I'll cite the civil code violations, demand they immediately pay for all damages, and threaten legal action if they don't comply. I'm also going to request an emergency meeting with the HOA board. You have a right to address the board about this issue. You think they'll actually pay? Dennis leaned back in his chair. Honestly? Probably not without a fight. HOAs can be incredibly stubborn, especially when they think they're in the right. But we have a strong case. You followed all proper procedures, got your permits, built according to code, and they destroyed your property without due process. Any reasonable court would find in your favor. How long does something like this take? Could be months, could be over a year if they drag it out, but we'll push for a quick resolution. The fact that the city confirmed your permits are valid is huge. We can also explore filing a complaint with the California Department of Real Estate if the HOA violated fair housing or due process laws. I left Dennis's office feeling slightly better, but still angry. This was going to be a long, expensive fight, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd followed every rule, jumped through every hoop, and Patricia Brennan had still found a way to destroy what I'd built. That evening, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman's crisp voice said, "Is this Connor Walsh?" Speaking. "This is Patricia Brennan, president of the Riverside Meadows HOA. I understand there was some confusion this morning regarding an unauthorized structure on your property." Confusion. She called the demolition of my guest house confusion. "There was no confusion," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You ordered the demolition of my legal, permitted guest house without any notice or authorization. That's not confusion. That's destruction of property." "Mr. Walsh, I reviewed your file this afternoon, and I can assure you that structure was not properly approved by the Architectural Review Committee. You attended some preliminary meetings, but you never received final written approval. Building without HOA approval is a violation of our covenants. You told me in the third meeting that if I got city approval, the committee wouldn't stand in my way. I got city approval. I got permits. I followed every rule. Verbal comments in a meeting are not the same as official approval. You needed written authorization from the committee, which you never obtained. Furthermore, upon inspection of the completed structure, we determined it violated several covenant requirements regarding setbacks and architectural consistency." That's a lie. I built exactly what I showed you in the architectural drawings. The city inspected everything and confirmed it met code. You had no right to tear it down. Patricia's voice got colder. "Mr. Walsh, I understand you're upset, but the HOA has both the authority and the responsibility to enforce our covenants. This community has standards, and we can't allow homeowners to simply ignore the rules because they find them inconvenient. If you believe the board acted improperly, you're welcome to request a hearing, but I can assure you the decision will be upheld. My lawyer is sending you a demand letter. You're going to pay for every penny of damage you caused. The HOA stands behind its decision. If you choose to pursue legal action, that's your right, but I'm confident we'll prevail. Have a good evening, Mr. Walsh." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, shaking with anger. She wasn't even pretending to be reasonable. She'd made up her mind that I'd violated some rule, and no amount of evidence was going to change it. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Dennis sent the demand letter, and the HOA responded through their lawyer, a firm called Henderson and Associates. Their response was essentially a more formal version of what Patricia had told me. The HOA claimed I'd never received proper approval. The structure violated covenants, and they had acted within their authority. They denied any liability and suggested I remove the remaining foundation myself or face additional fines. Dennis filed a lawsuit in Riverside County Superior Court on my behalf. We sued the HOA for destruction of property, violation of due process, breach of covenant of good faith, and several other claims. We asked for actual damages to cover the cost of rebuilding, punitive damages for the HOA's conduct, attorney's fees, and an injunction preventing them from interfering with reconstruction. The lawsuit made local news. A reporter from the Riverside Press Enterprise called and asked if I'd talk about the case. I was hesitant at first, but Dennis thought it might help. Public pressure can be effective with HOAs, he said. They don't like looking like bullies in the newspaper. So I talked to the reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen, who seemed genuinely outraged by what had happened. The article ran a few days later with the headline, "Riverside HOA Demolishes Homeowner's Permitted Guest House Without Warning." It included photos of the destruction and quotes from me and Dennis. The HOA declined to comment beyond a brief statement, saying they enforced community standards in accordance with established covenants. The article got shared on social media, and suddenly, I was getting messages from people all over Riverside and beyond. Other homeowners shared their own HOA horror stories. A few neighbors from Riverside Meadows reached out privately to say they'd had problems with Patricia too. One guy, Tom Henderson, told me Patricia had fined him $500 because his front door wreath was too large and ostentatious. Another woman, Sarah Kim, said Patricia had threatened to put a lien on her house because she'd planted roses in her front yard without architectural committee approval, even though roses were specifically listed as acceptable plants in the covenant guidelines. The support was nice, but it didn't rebuild my guest house. I still had a pile of rubble in my backyard and no money to fix it. My parents' visit was 3 weeks away, and I had to call them to explain what happened. My dad took it surprisingly well. "Don't worry about us, son. We can get a hotel room." "Dad, that's not the point. I built that guest house for you guys. I wanted you to have a comfortable place to stay during treatments." "We'll be comfortable anywhere as long as we're with you. Just focus on fighting this HOA. Don't let them get away with it." 2 weeks after the demolition, Dennis got a call from the city planning office. They'd received a complaint from the Riverside Meadows HOA claiming my permits had been issued in error. The HOA alleged that the guest house exceeded height restrictions and violated setback requirements, and they were demanding the city revoke the permits retroactively. "Can they do that?" I asked Dennis when he told me. "They can file a complaint, but it's not going to go anywhere. The city already approved everything and conducted inspections. Unless there was a legitimate error in the permit process, they're not going to retroactively revoke it. But it shows the HOA is doubling down. They're trying to create a paper trail to justify their actions." "This is insane. Why are they so determined to prove I was wrong?" "Pride, probably. Patricia Brennan made a decision, and admitting she was wrong would make her look bad. So she's going to fight to the bitter end to justify what she did. It's stupid, but it's common with HOA disputes." The city scheduled a hearing to review the HOA's complaint. I had to take a day off work to attend, bringing all my documentation once again. The hearing was in a conference room at City Hall with a 3-member panel from the planning department. Patricia Brennan showed up with 2 other HOA board members and their lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit named Richard Henderson. Henderson presented the HOA's case, arguing that my guest house exceeded the maximum allowed height for accessory structures in my zoning district and violated setback requirements from the rear property line. He had diagrams and calculations, all designed to make it look like the city had made a mistake in approving my permits. Then, it was my turn. I presented the architectural drawings that had been submitted with my permit application, along with the city's approval documents and inspection reports. I showed photos of the completed structure before the demolition, clearly demonstrating it was 12 feet tall, well under the 15-foot maximum for accessory structures. I also showed the site survey that proved the structure was 20 feet from the rear property line, exceeding the required 10-foot setback. The planning panel asked questions, reviewed the documents, and then asked to speak with the inspector who had conducted the final inspection. They called him right there from the conference room, putting him on speakerphone. Inspector Dave Larson confirmed that he'd personally measured the height and setbacks during his inspection, and everything had been within code. "So to be clear," one of the panel members said, "you found no violations during your inspection?" "That's correct," Inspector Larson said through the phone. "The structure met all requirements. I wouldn't have passed it otherwise." The panel deliberated for about 10 minutes while we all sat there in awkward silence. Patricia kept glancing at me with this look that I couldn't quite read, somewhere between anger and smugness. I avoided eye contact, focusing on my documents. Finally, the panel chair spoke. After reviewing the evidence and speaking with the inspector, we find no basis to revoke the permits issued for the guest house at 4532 Meadowbrook Lane. The structure was properly permitted, built according to code, and passed all required inspections. The HOA's complaint is denied. I felt a wave of relief. Dennis squeezed my shoulder. Patricia's face went red. Richard Henderson, the HOA lawyer, stood up. The HOA respectfully disagrees with this finding and reserves the right to pursue further administrative appeals. The panel chair looked tired. That's your right, but I can tell you right now that any appeal will reach the same conclusion. The permits were issued correctly. After the hearing, I walked out of City Hall feeling vindicated but exhausted. Patricia and her lawyer left quickly, not making eye contact with anyone. Dennis and I stood in the parking lot and he grinned. That went well. The city basically just confirmed everything we've been saying. Their complaint was frivolous. So what happens now? Now we push harder in the lawsuit. We have the city's official finding that your permits were valid and the structure was legal. The HOA has no leg to stand on. I'm going to file a motion for summary judgment. With this evidence, we might not even need to go to trial. But the HOA wasn't done. A week later, I received a formal violation notice in the mail. It stated that the debris from the demolished guest house was unsightly and violated covenant standards for property maintenance. I was given 14 days to remove all debris and restore the area to neat and orderly condition or face fines of $100 per day. I actually laughed when I read it. They'd torn down my building, and now they were threatening to fine me for not cleaning up the mess they'd created fast enough. Dennis wasn't amused. This is harassment. They're retaliating against you for filing the lawsuit. We're adding this to our complaint and filing for an emergency injunction. The injunction hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, I hired a junk removal company to clear the debris. It cost me $2,000, money I didn't really have, but I didn't want to give Patricia any more ammunition. The crew came out and hauled away all the broken wood, drywall, fixtures, and glass. When they were done, all that remained was the concrete foundation slab, sitting lonely and useless in the corner of my yard. My parents arrived the week before the injunction hearing. Dad looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, and he moved slowly. Mom looked exhausted, the kind of deep exhaustion that comes from months of caretaking and worry. They'd booked a room at a Hampton Inn 10 minutes away, insisting they didn't want to be any trouble. "You're not trouble," I said, helping carry their bags into the hotel. "I should have a place for you to stay." "Connor, stop," Mom said. "We're fine. We're here to see you and spend time with you, not to stress about sleeping arrangements. How are you holding up with all this legal business?" "I'm okay. My lawyer says we have a good case." Dad sat down heavily on the hotel bed. "Your mother showed me the news article. That HOA president sounds like a piece of work." "That's putting it mildly." Over the next few days, I split my time between work, visits with my parents, and preparing for the injunction hearing. Dad had treatment appointments at the cancer center, and I drove him when Mom needed a break. Sitting in those waiting rooms, surrounded by other families dealing with serious illness, put the HOA drama in perspective. This was what mattered, being there for family. The guest house had been about that too, creating a space where my parents could be comfortable during a difficult time. Patricia Brennan had taken that away from us, and the anger I felt about it was tied up with the helplessness of watching my dad fight cancer. The injunction hearing was different from the city planning hearing. This was in actual court, with a judge in robes and a formal procedure. Dennis presented our case, explaining the timeline of events, the city's confirmation of my valid permits, and the HOA's continued harassment through violation notices and fines. He argued that the HOA was retaliating against me for exercising my legal rights and that they should be enjoined from any further enforcement actions related to the guest house. Richard Henderson argued that the HOA was simply enforcing legitimate covenant violations. He claimed the violation notice about debris was unrelated to the guest house dispute and was a standard property maintenance issue. He also argued that our lawsuit was without merit and that the HOA had acted properly throughout. Judge Sarah Martinez, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, listened to both sides and then asked pointed questions. "Mr. Henderson, your client demolished Mr. Walsh's structure without any prior notice or hearing, correct?" "The structure was built without proper HOA approval, Your Honor. The covenants give the HOA authority to address violations." "But did you provide notice and an opportunity to be heard before taking such drastic action?" Henderson hesitated. "The violation was clear and ongoing, Your Honor. The structure itself was the violation." "That's not an answer to my question. Did you provide notice?" "Not formal written notice prior to the demolition, but Mr. Walsh was aware through previous meetings that the structure might not be approved." Judge Martinez looked skeptical. "Might not be approved is very different from scheduling a demolition. What about the city permits? Were you aware Mr. Walsh had obtained city approval?" "We believe the permits were issued in error, Your Honor. But the city has since confirmed the permits were proper, is that correct?" "The city's interpretation differs from our reading of the applicable codes." "Mr. Henderson, I don't think you're in a position to override the city's interpretation of its own zoning codes. That seems extraordinarily arrogant." Judge Martinez flipped through some documents. "I'm granting a preliminary injunction. The HOA is prohibited from assessing any fines, sending violation notices, or taking any enforcement actions related to Mr. Walsh's property pending resolution of the underlying lawsuit. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to suspend Mr. Walsh's obligation to pay any HOA dues until this matter is resolved. The HOA created this situation through its own actions, and I'm not going to allow it to continue harassing the plaintiff." Dennis and I exchanged glances. That was better than we'd hoped for. Henderson stood up. "Your Honor, suspending dues payments will create a precedent that could undermine HOA authority throughout the district. Then HOAs should act more carefully before destroying homeowners' legal structures," Judge Martinez said dryly. "The injunction is granted. I'll issue a written order by end of business today." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Dennis was grinning. "Did you hear her? That was about as close to a judicial smackdown as you get in civil court. She clearly thinks the HOA screwed up." "Does this mean we're going to win the lawsuit?" "It's a very good sign. The judge basically telegraphed how she views the case. If we end up in front of her for trial, I like our chances. But I'm betting the HOA will want to settle now. That hearing didn't go well for them." Dennis was partially right. 2 weeks later, Henderson called him with a settlement offer. The HOA would pay me $25,000 in exchange for dropping the lawsuit and signing a release of all claims. They'd also agree to allow me to rebuild the guest house, with the understanding that I'd submit new plans to the Architectural Review Committee. $25,000 isn't enough, I told Dennis. I spent $60,000 building it the first time, and the contractor says it'll cost $70,000 to rebuild because prices have gone up, plus all the stress and my attorney's fees. They're not even covering my actual damages. "I agree," Dennis said. "I told Henderson we'd consider nothing less than full damages plus attorney's fees. He said he'd take it back to the board." The next offer came a week later, $40,000, still not enough. We countered at $90,000, itemizing the rebuild costs, attorney's fees, and some compensation for emotional distress and time lost from work dealing with this mess. Henderson said the board wouldn't go higher than $50,000. "We're at an impasse," Dennis told me. "We can keep negotiating or we can proceed to trial. What do you want to do?" I thought about it. $50,000 would cover most of the rebuild, though I'd still be out of pocket for the difference and probably some of the attorney's fees. But going to trial meant more time, more stress, more uncertainty. On the other hand, I wanted the HOA to really pay for what they'd done. I wanted Patricia Brennan to admit she'd been wrong. "Let's go to trial," I said. "I don't want to settle for half of what they owe me." Dennis nodded. "Okay, I'll tell Henderson we're proceeding to trial. Discovery is going to be extensive. We'll depose Patricia and the other board members, get all their internal communications about your project. It's going to get ugly." Good. Let it get ugly. Discovery was enlightening. Through the legal process, Dennis obtained emails and text messages between HOA board members. What we found was damning. Patricia had never intended to approve my guest house. In an email to another board member sent the day after our second meeting, she'd written, "Connor Walsh is too big for his britches. He thinks he can throw around building codes and tell me what the covenants mean. I'm going to make sure his little project never happens. We'll let him build it and then force him to tear it down. That'll teach him to respect the committee's authority." Another board member had replied, "Are you sure that's wise? If he has city permits, we might not have grounds to stop him." Patricia's response, "Leave it to me. I'll find a violation. There's always something." When Dennis showed me those emails, I felt vindicated and furious at the same time. She'd been planning to screw me over from the start. This wasn't about covenants or rules. It was about power and control. I'd challenged her authority by questioning her interpretation of the rules, and she'd decided to punish me for it. We also got the HOA's communications with the demolition company. Patricia had personally ordered the demolition, signing the work order with her own name. The work order had false information on it, claiming the structure was unpermitted and illegal when she knew I had city permits. She deliberately misrepresented the situation to get the demolition company to do the work. "This is fraud," Dennis said, reviewing the documents. "She lied to the demolition company to induce them to destroy your property. That's potentially criminal." "Can we have her arrested?" "Possibly. Let me talk to the district attorney's office. This might be worth pursuing as a criminal case, not just civil." The possibility of criminal charges changed the dynamic. Dennis reached out to the Riverside County District Attorney's Office and spoke with a prosecutor named Angela Torres. After reviewing the evidence, Torres agreed to open an investigation. She couldn't promise charges would be filed, but the case warranted looking into. Meanwhile, our trial date was set for 4 months out. Dennis continued deposing witnesses and gathering evidence. He deposed Patricia, and according to him, she was evasive and hostile throughout. She maintained that she'd acted properly, that my permits were irrelevant to HOA approval, and that she'd had every right to order the demolition. "She's either delusional or incredibly arrogant," Dennis told me. "She won't admit any wrongdoing, even when confronted with her own emails. She keeps insisting she was protecting the community's interests." We also deposed the other board members. 2 of them, Brad Simmons and Linda Morse, admitted they'd had concerns about Patricia's handling of my case. Brad said he'd argued against the demolition, warning Patricia it could expose the HOA to liability. Linda said she'd thought Patricia should have given me formal written notice before taking action, but neither of them had pushed back hard enough to stop her. As the trial date approached, I started preparing to testify. Dennis coached me on how to answer questions, stay calm, and not let Henderson rattle me during cross-examination. We did practice sessions in his office, with him playing the role of hostile attorney. "The key is to stay factual," he said. "Answer the question directly, don't elaborate unless necessary, and don't let them make you angry. Henderson's going to try to paint you as someone who deliberately flouted HOA rules. We need to show you did everything right." 2 weeks before trial, Dennis got a call from Angela Torres at the DA's office. She wanted to meet with me to discuss the criminal investigation. I went to her office downtown, a busy place filled with prosecutors and staff rushing around with files and coffee cups. Torres was a sharp woman in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a bun and an intense gaze. She had me walk through the entire story again, asking detailed questions about Patricia's conduct, the demolition, and the financial impact. "Mr. Walsh, I've reviewed the evidence your attorney provided, including the emails and work order. I believe there's sufficient basis to file criminal charges against Patricia Brennan for vandalism under California Penal Code Section 594. The fact that she knowingly and maliciously ordered the destruction of your property using false information to do so meets the elements of the crime." My heart started pounding. "You're going to charge her?" "I'm going to present the case to my supervisor for approval. But yes, I believe charges are warranted. Vandalism causing damage over $400 is a wobbler, meaning it can be charged as either a misdemeanor or felony. Given the extent of the damage here, $60,000, I'd recommend felony charges." "What happens if she's convicted?" "Felony vandalism can carry up to 3 years in prison, though first offenders typically get probation and restitution. But the conviction itself would be significant. It would be a public record, and she'd likely be forced to resign from the HOA board. Do it, I said. She needs to face consequences. Torres nodded. I'll keep you updated on the process. These things take time, but I'm confident we can move forward. The news that Patricia might face criminal charges spread through the neighborhood quickly. I don't know who leaked it, maybe someone at the DA's office or the courthouse, but within days people were talking. Some neighbors were shocked, others were supportive, saying it was about time someone held Patricia accountable. A few HOA loyalists thought I was going too far, that criminal charges were overkill for a civil dispute. I didn't care what they thought. Patricia had deliberately destroyed my property out of spite and arrogance. She'd lied to get it done, and she'd never shown a shred of remorse. If that didn't warrant criminal charges, I didn't know what did. One evening, about a week before trial, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Brad Simmons standing there, looking uncomfortable. Brad was in his early 50s, a mild-mannered accountant who'd been on the HOA board for years. "Connor, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure, come in." We sat in my living room, and Brad fidgeted with his hands. "I wanted to apologize for what happened with your guest house. I should have pushed back harder against Patricia. I knew she was out of line, but I didn't want to cause conflict on the board." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm done with the HOA. I'm resigning from the board after this mess. Patricia has turned the whole thing into her personal fiefdom, and I don't want to be part of it anymore. I just wanted you to know that not everyone on the board supported what she did. Some of us tried to talk her out of it, but she wouldn't listen. That's not much comfort when my guest house is gone. I know, and I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm going to testify honestly at trial if I'm called. I'm not going to cover for her." After Brad left, I felt a mix of emotions. His apology was something, but it didn't undo the damage. Still, knowing that some board members were willing to break ranks with Patricia might help at trial. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in early November. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly yellow tint. Judge Martinez presided, looking as sharp and no-nonsense as she had during the injunction hearing. The jury was 12 people, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Dennis gave our opening statement, laying out the facts clearly. I was a homeowner who followed all the rules, got proper permits, built a legal structure, and had it destroyed by an HOA president with a personal vendetta. We'd proved through documents and testimony that Patricia Brennan had acted maliciously and outside her authority, causing me significant financial and emotional harm. Henderson gave the HOA's opening, arguing that the case was about an overreaching homeowner who thought city permits exempted him from HOA rules. He claimed Patricia had acted to protect property values and community standards, and that any damage to my guest house was my own fault for building without proper HOA approval. The first few days of trial were dominated by document presentation and expert testimony. Dennis called the city planning inspector, Dave Larson, who confirmed everything about my permits being proper. He called Miguel Santos, my contractor, who testified about the quality of the construction and the cost to rebuild. He called a real estate appraiser who said my guest house would have increased my property value by at least $50,000, meaning the HOA's actions had diminished my property's worth. Henderson tried to poke holes in their testimony, but the facts were solid. The permits were legitimate, the construction met code, the structure was legal. Then it was time for me to testify. I'd been dreading this part. Standing up in court, raising my right hand, swearing to tell the truth, sitting in the witness chair with everyone staring at me. Dennis led me through my testimony, asking about the planning process, the meetings with Patricia, the construction, and the morning of the demolition. I tried to stay calm and factual, just like he'd coached me. "How did you feel when you saw the demolition crew destroying your guest house?" Dennis asked. "Devastated, angry, confused. I'd spent 8 months planning that project. I'd spent $60,000 building it. I'd done everything right, followed every rule. And then one morning it was just gone, torn apart by strangers who wouldn't listen when I told them to stop." "What was the guest house for?" "My parents. My dad has cancer and they visit for treatments. I wanted them to have a comfortable private place to stay. Instead, they had to get a hotel room. I saw a couple of jurors nodding sympathetically. Henderson's cross-examination was aggressive, but I held my ground. He tried to suggest I'd been deliberately vague with the HOA, that I'd known Patricia had concerns and built anyway. I pointed out that Patricia had said verbally that she wouldn't stand in my way if I got city approval, which I did. He tried to suggest the guest house violated covenants. I showed him the covenant language and explained how my structure complied with every requirement. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt drained but okay. I'd told my story, and I'd been honest. Patricia testified next, and it was fascinating in a train wreck kind of way. She was poised at first, explaining her role as HOA president and her responsibility to enforce covenants. But as Dennis cross-examined her, she got defensive. When he showed her the email where she'd talked about teaching me a lesson, she tried to claim it was taken out of context. "Ms. Brennan, you wrote, and I quote, 'We'll let him build it and then force him to tear it down. That will teach him to respect the committee's authority.' What context makes that statement appropriate?" I was frustrated. Mr. Walsh had been argumentative in our meetings. He questioned my interpretation of the covenants. I felt he wasn't showing proper respect for the process. "So you decided to punish him by ordering the destruction of his property?" "That's not what I said. I ordered the demolition because the structure violated our covenants." "But it didn't violate the covenants, did it? The city confirmed the permits were valid. The structure met all setback and height requirements. You just didn't like that Mr. Walsh challenged you." Patricia's face got red. "The HOA has a responsibility to maintain community standards. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions." "Difficult decisions? Or vindictive ones?" Henderson objected, and Judge Martinez sustained it. But the damage was done. Patricia looked petty and spiteful on the stand. When Dennis asked her why she hadn't given me any written notice before ordering the demolition, she couldn't give a good answer. When he asked why she'd listed the structure as unpermitted on the demolition work order when she knew I had city permits, she stammered and said it was a mistake. The jury didn't look convinced. Closing arguments came at the end of the second week. Dennis hammered home the key points. I'd followed all rules, obtained proper permits, built according to code, and Patricia had destroyed my property without notice or due process, based on personal animosity. He asked the jury to award full damages for the rebuild cost, attorney's fees, and punitive damages to punish the HOA's egregious conduct. Henderson argued that the HOA had acted in good faith to enforce legitimate covenant concerns and that any damages should be minimal. He suggested a verdict of no liability, or at most a small award for any procedural irregularities. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. They found in my favor on all claims: destruction of property, violation of due process, breach of the covenant of good faith, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They awarded me $70,000 for the cost to rebuild the guest house, $45,000 for attorney's fees, and $100,000 in punitive damages. I almost couldn't process it. $215,000. The courtroom was silent except for someone's gasp. I looked over at Patricia, who was pale and staring straight ahead. Henderson was writing something on a legal pad, his jaw tight. Judge Martinez thanked the jury and set a date for a post-trial hearing to address any motions. As people filed out of the courtroom, Dennis shook my hand, grinning. We won. Not just won, we crushed them. I felt numb. What happens now? Now they have 30 days to file an appeal, but I doubt they will. That verdict was solid, and the judge isn't going to overturn it. They'll probably try to negotiate the punitive damages down, but you've got a judgment. You can start rebuilding. Outside the courthouse, a couple of reporters were waiting. I gave a brief statement saying I was grateful for the jury's decision and that I hoped it would send a message to HOAs about respecting homeowners' rights and following proper procedures. I didn't gloat or trash Patricia, though I wanted to. That evening, my phone rang. It was Brad Simmons again. Connor, I wanted to let you know that Patricia resigned from the HOA board about an hour ago. She sent an email to all the members stepping down as president, effective immediately. There's going to be an emergency election to replace her. Good, I said. She never should have been in that position in the first place. I agree. I also wanted to tell you that the board voted tonight to accept your guest house as a compliant structure. No more objections, no more drama. You can rebuild whenever you're ready. That news was almost better than the jury verdict. I could rebuild. I could finish what I'd started. My parents could have their guest house. 2 weeks later, Angela Torres called. "Connor, I wanted to update you on the criminal case. We've filed charges against Patricia Brennan for felony vandalism. She was arraigned this morning and pleaded not guilty. Trial is set for next spring." "What are the chances of conviction?" "With your testimony and the documentary evidence, I'd say strong. Her own emails are devastating. She might take a plea deal to avoid trial." That's exactly what happened. In January, Patricia's criminal defense lawyer negotiated a plea agreement. Patricia pleaded no contest to 1 count of felony vandalism. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to pay restitution equal to the civil judgment amount, and required to perform 300 hours of community service. She also had to resign from any HOA positions and was prohibited from serving on an HOA board during her probation period. I watched her sentencing hearing from the gallery. Patricia looked smaller somehow, diminished. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she stood and gave a brief statement. "I made mistakes in how I handled the situation with Mr. Walsh's guest house. I let my frustration override my judgment, and I'm sorry for the harm I caused. I hope Mr. Walsh can rebuild and that the community can move forward." It wasn't a great apology, but it was something. The judge accepted the plea deal and imposed the sentence. Patricia walked out of the courthouse with her lawyer, not looking at anyone. I never saw her again. According to Brad, she moved out of Riverside Meadows a few months later. With the judgment and the criminal restitution order, I had the funds to rebuild. Miguel and I started work in February. This time, the HOA was nothing but helpful. The new board president, a reasonable guy named Frank Martinez, fast-tracked my architectural review and sent me a formal letter of approval within a week. The city already issued permits quickly since the plans were identical to the original approved project. The rebuild took 4 months. Miguel's crew worked carefully, replacing everything that had been destroyed. New framing, new roof, new windows, new bathroom and kitchenette. By June, the guest house was done again, looking exactly like it had before the demolition. My parents came to visit in July. Dad's cancer was in remission, a small miracle we were all grateful for. When they arrived, I walked them out to the guest house, unlocking the door and showing them inside. "This is beautiful, Connor," Mom said, tears in her eyes. "It was worth the wait." Dad sat down on the couch, looking around at the space. "You fought for this, son. You didn't back down when that HOA tried to bully you. I'm proud of you." We spent 3 weeks together that summer. Dad gained some weight back, and we took easy walks around the neighborhood in the evenings. Mom cooked in my kitchen, filling the house with the smells of childhood. My parents had their privacy in the guest house, their own space to rest and recharge. It was everything I'd hoped it would be when I first planned the project. The legal fight had been exhausting and expensive, even with the judgment covering most of my costs. But sitting on my back deck with my parents, watching the sunset and talking about nothing important, I knew it had been worth it. Patricia Brennan had tried to exert power and control, to punish me for questioning her authority. She'd broken rules and laws to do it, and she'd paid the price. The story made waves beyond Riverside. Other HOA horror stories surfaced, and there was a push in the California legislature to strengthen homeowner protections. A bill was introduced that would require HOAs to provide formal written notice and a hearing before taking any enforcement action involving property destruction or significant fines. It passed the following year, informally nicknamed Connor's Law by some of the advocates who'd supported it. I still live in Riverside Meadows. The HOA is much more reasonable now under Frank's leadership. They enforce rules, but they do it fairly, with notice and due process. I serve on the Architectural Review Committee now, actually. When homeowners submit plans for projects, I make sure they're treated with respect and that they understand what's required. I never want anyone to go through what I went through. The guest house is still standing, solid and beautiful in the corner of my yard. My parents visit regularly, and sometimes I rent it out on Airbnb when they're not using it, making a little extra income. Every time I look at it, I remember the fight it took to keep it. I remember Patricia's face when the jury verdict was read. I remember standing in my backyard that morning, watching the demolition crew tear it apart, feeling helpless and furious. But mostly, I remember that I fought back. I didn't accept the injustice. I held them accountable. And in the end, justice actually worked the way it was supposed to. The city proved my permit was fully approved. The court vindicated my rights. The HOA paid for what they'd done. Patricia faced criminal consequences for her actions. It shouldn't have been necessary. I shouldn't have had to fight a 2-year legal battle to keep a structure I'd built legally on my own property. But when I did have to fight, I won. And that matters. The guest house stands as a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they have authority and bylaws on their side. Sometimes you have to trust the system, even when it seems slow and frustrating. And sometimes, if you persist and you're in the right, things actually work out. My dad's cancer came back last year, more aggressive this time. He's fighting again, with Mom by his side. They're staying in the guest house now for an extended period while he goes through treatment at the cancer center. Every morning, I bring them coffee and we sit on the guest house porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. We don't talk about HOAs or legal battles or the past struggles. We talk about today, about the small joys of being together. The guest house makes those mornings possible. It gives my parents dignity and comfort during a difficult time. It's a physical manifestation of family love and perseverance. And it's still standing because I refuse to let Patricia Brennan's petty tyranny win. Some people think HOAs are necessary evils, maintaining property values and community standards. Others think they're authoritarian nightmares run by busybodies with too much time and too little oversight. After my experience, I think the truth is somewhere in between. HOAs can serve legitimate purposes when run by reasonable people who remember they're supposed to serve the community, not control it. But when someone like Patricia gets power and lets it corrupt them, when they start using rules as weapons to punish people who challenge them, the system breaks down. The key is accountability. Without oversight, without consequences for abuse of power, HOAs can become little fiefdoms where board members act like petty dictators. My case proved that accountability is possible. The civil courts, the criminal justice system, and public pressure all worked together to hold Patricia accountable for what she did. It took time and money and stress, but it worked. I hope other homeowners facing similar situations read about my case and feel empowered to fight back. You don't have to accept it when an HOA violates your rights. You don't have to tolerate board members who abuse their power. Document everything, follow proper procedures, get good legal advice, and don't back down. The system isn't perfect, but it can work if you're persistent. Looking back now, 2.5 years after that awful morning when I woke up to demolition equipment, I can see how the experience changed me. I'm more careful about documentation, more aware of my rights, more skeptical of authority that isn't backed by clear rules and fair process. I'm also more connected to my community. The support I got from neighbors during the fight meant a lot, and I've tried to pay that forward by being more involved in neighborhood issues and supporting others who have problems with the HOA. Frank Martinez, the current HOA president, is term limited and will be stepping down next year. Several people have approached me about running for the position. I'm considering it. Not because I want power or control, but because I want to make sure Riverside Meadows never again has a board president who thinks destroying someone's property is an acceptable way to enforce rules. I want to model what responsible HOA leadership looks like: transparent, fair, respectful of homeowners' rights, and focused on genuine community benefit rather than personal power. My lawyer Dennis became a good friend through all this. We get together for lunch every couple of months, and he always asks how the guest house is holding up. He's representing other homeowners in HOA disputes now, using my case as a template for how to fight back effectively. He says HOA lawyers are more cautious now in our area, more likely to advise their clients to follow proper procedures rather than taking aggressive action. If that's true, if my case has made even a small difference in how HOAs operate, then all the stress and cost was worth something beyond my personal vindication. The money from the judgment went mostly to rebuilding and paying legal fees, but there was some left over. I donated $10,000 to a nonprofit that provides legal assistance to homeowners in disputes with HOAs. They do great work helping people who can't afford lawyers like Dennis. Every homeowner deserves a fighting chance when they're facing an HOA that's overstepped its authority. Patricia's criminal conviction remains on her record. Felony vandalism isn't something you can easily explain away. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had trouble finding a new place to live because some landlords and HOAs won't accept applicants with felony convictions. There's irony in that. An HOA president brought down by her own zealotry to the point where she can't live in HOA communities anymore. I don't take pleasure in her difficulties, but I don't feel sorry for her either. She made choices, serious choices with serious consequences, and she's living with the results. The demolition company that tore down my guest house tried to sue the HOA for their fees, claiming the HOA had misrepresented the situation and they shouldn't have to eat the cost of the work. That case settled out of court, but I heard the HOA's insurance company paid most of it. The insurance company then tried to deny coverage for my judgment, claiming Patricia's actions were intentional and therefore not covered under the HOA's liability policy. That led to another legal fight, which the insurance company eventually lost. They had to pay the full judgment plus their own legal fees. The whole debacle probably cost the HOA's insurance company close to $400,000 between my judgment, the demolition company settlement, and legal fees. Their premiums went up significantly, which caused some grumbling among homeowners who had to pay increased HOA dues to cover it. I felt a little bad about that, about regular homeowners paying more because of Patricia's actions. But I also thought it was appropriate. The homeowners had elected Patricia. They'd given her power. They bore some collective responsibility for her abuse of that power. Maybe higher dues would make people pay more attention to who they elect to HOA boards and what those board members do with their authority. The Riverside Press Enterprise did a follow-up article a year after the verdict, looking at the broader impact of the case. They interviewed several other homeowners who'd had problems with Patricia during her tenure as president. The stories were remarkably consistent. Patricia would find some minor violation, blow it out of proportion, refuse to listen to reason, and threaten or impose disproportionate consequences. One couple had nearly lost their home to an HOA lien because Patricia claimed their driveway needed repaving, even though it was in fine condition. Another family had been fined thousands of dollars for a swing set in their backyard that Patricia claimed violated height restrictions, despite the covenant language clearly allowing play equipment. All of these people had eventually resolved their disputes, usually by backing down and giving Patricia what she wanted. I was the first one who'd fought back to the end, who'd refused to be bullied into compliance. Reading their stories made me realize how widespread the problem had been and how much damage one person with unchecked power can do. The article also noted that HOA complaints to the California Department of Real Estate had increased dramatically in recent years, with many involving allegations of board members abusing their authority. There was a growing movement for HOA reform, including proposals for mandatory training for board members, stricter oversight by state agencies, and enhanced homeowner rights. My case was cited as an example of what could go wrong and why reforms were necessary. I testified before a state legislative committee that was considering HOA reform legislation. It was intimidating, sitting at a table in the state capitol with legislators asking me questions, but I told my story clearly. I emphasized that I wasn't against HOAs in principle, but that there needed to be checks on their power and consequences when they violated homeowners' rights. Several legislators thanked me for my testimony and said it would inform their work on the reform bill. The bill that eventually passed wasn't perfect, but it included some important protections. HOAs now have to provide at least 30 days written notice before taking enforcement action for most violations, with detailed information about the alleged violation and the homeowner's right to request a hearing. They can't impose fines exceeding certain amounts without a hearing. They have to maintain detailed records of all enforcement actions and make those records available to homeowners. And homeowners who prevail in disputes with HOAs are entitled to attorney's fees, making it less financially risky to fight back. Would these reforms have prevented what happened to me? Maybe. If Patricia had been required to give me 30 days' notice before ordering the demolition, I could have gotten a lawyer involved immediately and possibly stopped it before it happened. If there had been mandatory record-keeping requirements, her emails plotting to teach me a lesson might have been more easily discoverable. If attorney's fees had been guaranteed, I might have been less hesitant about filing suit. But reforms only work if they're enforced, and enforcement is always the challenge with HOA disputes. Most homeowners don't have the time, money, or willingness to fight extended legal battles. Even with better laws, HOAs can still make people's lives miserable if they're determined to do so. The real solution is cultural. HOA boards need to understand that they're service organizations, not governments, and their job is to maintain the community, not control the people who live there. I think about Patricia sometimes and wonder if she learned anything from the experience. Did she recognize that her need for control and her inability to accept being questioned had led to her downfall? Did she feel remorse for the damage she'd caused, not just to me, but to other homeowners she'd bullied over the years? Or did she see herself as a victim, someone who'd tried to do the right thing and been unfairly persecuted for it? I'll probably never know. Our paths are unlikely to cross again. She lives somewhere else now, presumably keeping a lower profile given her criminal record. I hope she's not in any position of power over other people. The world has enough petty tyrants without Patricia Brennan adding to their numbers. The guest house just had its 3rd anniversary of the rebuild completion. I marked the occasion by having a small party, inviting neighbors and friends who'd supported me during the legal battle. Miguel came, along with Dennis and his wife. Frank Martinez from the HOA board stopped by. Even Brad Simmons showed up, retired now from the board but still living in the neighborhood. We stood on the guest house porch, drinking beer and talking about how much had changed in 3 years. "You know what the best part is?" Miguel said. "This is a better build than the original. We learned from the first one, made some improvements. It's going to last 50 years easy." I looked around at the structure, solid and well built, and thought about what it represented. It wasn't just a building. It was proof that standing up for yourself matters. It was proof that bullies can be held accountable. It was proof that the system, for all its flaws, can sometimes deliver justice. My dad's latest scans showed the tumors shrinking. The treatment was working. He'd be in remission again soon, the doctor said, and he'd hopefully have years ahead of him. He and my mom were planning a trip to see my sister in Colorado once he finished this round of chemotherapy, and then they'd come back to stay in the guest house for a while. Having this space for them, this comfortable haven where they could be close but independent, continued to feel like one of the best decisions I'd ever made. The financial impact of the whole ordeal was significant, but not devastating. Between the judgment, the insurance proceeds, and some savings, I'd been able to rebuild and cover my costs. I still had legal bills that exceeded what the court had awarded for attorney's fees. Dennis had discounted his rates for me as a friend, but the total time he'd spent on the case was substantial. I was paying those off slowly, a few $100s a month. It would take another couple years, but it was manageable. The emotional toll was harder to quantify. The stress of the legal battle, the anger at Patricia and the HOA, the frustration with a system that moved slowly and didn't always seem fair, it had all taken a lot out of me. I'd had trouble sleeping during the worst of it. I'd snapped at friends and coworkers who didn't deserve it. I'd become somewhat obsessed with the case, spending hours researching HOA law and reading about similar disputes. But I'd also grown from the experience. I'd learned I was stronger than I thought, more capable of standing up for myself and persevering through difficulty. I'd learned which friends and neighbors were truly supportive, and which ones disappeared when things got tough. I'd learned that justice, while imperfect and expensive, was possible if you were willing to fight for it. And I'd learned the importance of documentation. Everything that happened in my case, from the initial HOA meetings through the demolition to the trial, was supported by documents, emails, permits, photographs, contracts, inspection reports. Without that paper trail, it would have been my word against Patricia's, and the outcome might have been very different. Now, I keep detailed records of everything important. If another conflict ever arises, I'll be ready. The neighborhood has been quieter since Patricia left. There are still occasional HOA disputes, people upset about fines or architectural review decisions, but nothing like the drama of my case. Frank runs the board with a light touch, focusing on necessary maintenance and genuine community concerns rather than petty rule enforcement. The Architectural Review Committee, which I now serve on, tries to work with homeowners to find solutions rather than looking for reasons to say no. Just last month, a couple down the street applied to build a detached garage in their backyard. Their plans were similar in scope to my guest house, and I watched carefully to see how the process would go. The committee reviewed the plans, asked some clarifying questions, verified they'd comply with city codes and HOA covenants, and approved the project within 2 weeks. The couple was thrilled. They'd been worried it would be a nightmare after hearing about my experience, but it was smooth and professional. That's how it should work. That's how it would have worked for me if Patricia had been reasonable. But she wasn't, and the whole neighborhood paid a price for her unreasonableness in increased insurance premiums, negative publicity, and the time and energy spent dealing with the fallout. I ran into Linda Morse at the grocery store a few months ago. She'd also left the HOA board after serving out her term, wanting nothing more to do with HOA politics. We talked in the produce section about how the neighborhood had changed. "I should have spoken up more when Patricia was going after you," Linda said. "I knew she was wrong, but I didn't want the conflict. I'm sorry." "It's okay. I understand why people don't want to rock the boat." "No, it's not okay. When you see someone abusing power and you stay silent, you're part of the problem. I learned that from watching what happened to you. I won't stay silent next time." That conversation stuck with me. How many other situations involve people who know something wrong is happening but don't speak up because it's easier to stay quiet? How much injustice continues because good people don't want conflict? My case had been public and documented, but there must be thousands of HOA disputes that never reach that level, where homeowners just give up and accept unfair treatment, because fighting back seems too hard. I hope the publicity around my case, the criminal conviction, the civil judgment, and the legislative reforms it inspired sends a message that fighting back is possible and sometimes necessary. HOA board members need to know they can't act with impunity. Homeowners need to know they have rights and remedies. And everyone needs to remember that rules and authority are only legitimate when they're exercised fairly and for genuine community benefit, not personal power or spite. The sun is setting now as I finish typing this, sitting on my back deck with a glass of wine. The guest house is lit up, warm yellow light glowing from the windows. My parents are inside, probably watching TV or reading. In a little while, I'll walk over and see if they want to join me for dinner. We'll cook something simple, eat on the deck, and talk about nothing important. These ordinary moments are what the fight was really about, not the legal principles or the money or the vindication, though all of that mattered. It was about protecting my ability to care for my family in the way I thought best. It was about having the freedom to make decisions about my own property without arbitrary interference. It was about being treated with basic dignity and respect by an organization that was supposed to serve me, not rule me. Patricia Brennan forgot that. She forgot that HOA presidents are supposed to be stewards, not sovereigns. She forgot that every homeowner deserves due process and fair treatment. She forgot that power is a responsibility, not a right. And when she forgot those things, when she let her ego and need for control override her judgment, she set in motion a chain of events that cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and her home. I didn't want any of that for her. I just wanted my guest house to be left alone. But she forced the confrontation, and once it started, I wasn't going to back down. The stakes were too high, and the principle was too important. Now, 3 years later, life has returned to normal. The guest house stands. My parents visit and stay comfortably. The neighborhood functions peacefully under more reasonable HOA leadership. And I have a story to tell, a story about standing up to injustice and persevering through a difficult fight. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, facing an HOA or any other authority that's overstepping its bounds, remember my experience. Document everything, know your rights, get good legal advice, don't be afraid to fight back. And most importantly, remember that you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for the principle that power should be exercised fairly, that rules should apply equally, and that ordinary people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Those principles matter. They're worth fighting for. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent and right, you actually win. The system works. Justice prevails. And the guest house keeps standing, a testament to one homeowner's refusal to be bullied by a petty tyrant with a title and a grudge. The guest house still stands, and it will stand for decades to come, long after everyone has forgotten the details of the legal battle that nearly destroyed it. Every time I look at it, I'll remember what it took to preserve it, and I'll be glad I fought.